found that this algorithm could be applied to much larger problems, is the focus of that book. I also am a former venture capital investor, and as you mentioned, I do work with a company that I founded called Black Sheep that does a range of things. One is we have an innovation advisory firm where we work with Fortune 500 companies and their executive teams to become more innovative and adaptive. And so I was privileged to be a part of General Electric's advisory board last year and learned a lot about how big companies are being disrupted these days, and then also work with a lot of entrepreneurs and creative types to do a creative lab that we have in San Francisco. So I just thought I'd share a few observations and then a little bit more about the research. So the first thing I would share is just this quote, which I really liked, just from Alec Ross, who was a senior advisor for innovation at the State Department. The 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. And I think that is a quote that really sets the tone for this very fast-changing high period of uncertainty that we're living through. And then the question is, well, how do you think and work in that time frame in an effective way? And my argument is that we've been taught for many years to be using an industrial mindset, as I call it, just to be able to plan everything that we do and really try to calculate out risks and potential rewards before we do something. And that is impossible in this increasingly complex world in many cases, especially when you're doing something new. But even when you're doing something that's relatively known, technology and globalization are disrupting processes and brands and our way of working so quickly that we really need a different mindset. So this is a picture of some Black Sheep. Black Sheep is kind of a guild of thinkers and doers. And there we were invited to 10 Downing Street last month to meet with advisors there on innovation. And I found the most interesting part of this visit was that in the United Kingdom, they're entering this period of a triple dip recession. So it's analogous to what many regions of the world are experiencing right now. This period of stagnation and search for new economic models. And in the United Kingdom, there really isn't much of a social welfare net for people to fall back on anymore. So after the first and second recessions, most of the middle class in the United Kingdom has spent through their savings, and families are now increasingly glomming together to try to survive what is a very, very difficult downturn. And depression-like set of circumstances, both in the United Kingdom and lots of parts of Europe, and as obviously parts of the Middle East as well, are experiencing these very difficult times. And what they said is that no longer can government be the solution to the problems. The solution to the problems must be discovered from the bottom up. They must be discovered by a lot of innovators, say in the councils or in these localized levels of the United Kingdom, and then the government can then scale up what's working. But there's this huge movement towards working in more collaborative ways where government works with corporations and nonprofits and philanthropy to be able to solve problems in new ways. And we see this pattern going on in the corporate world as well. It is a move away from trying to do everything in a very command and control way, and to leverage assets and networks in new and creative ways to be able to create value. So that's roughly where I think a lot of the opportunities are going to be across all sectors to be able to create new forms of value. And so, to just take it back to the problems with this planning mentality that is so prevalent in the way that we've been educated across the world, where there's this enormous risk aversion and this enormous fear of doing anything wrong. This is a slide that was prepared for General Stanley McChrystal, who was leading the U.S. Army's presence in Afghanistan, and this was from a couple years ago, 2010 time frame. and his staff prepared this slide for him to show their whole strategy for winning the war. And as you can see, this slide, which is trying to use deductive reasoning, makes no sense to anyone. And to try to deduce into one slide how to win in such a complicated set of circumstances and variables is crazy. I mean, we would basically agree with that. And the Crystal's response when the staff shared this with him was, when we understand that slide, we will have won the war. So that gets that's a humorous end to what is, though, a very deep problem for us all, which is this tendency to want to put everything together in a plan in front. So in the past, it used to be that the U.S., the Soviets, most conventional armies would fight in very structured ways. They used an engineering mindset to plan for warfare, and they had to because the Soviets were trained at traditional engineering military academies, and the United States training at West Point was very much driven by this engineering mindset, which is that you would memorize essentially a set of doctrine-approved solutions, a set of steps that you would take when undertaking any problem in warfare to try to solve for the solution. Now, of course, when you're in a situation where there's many unknowns, as is the case in modern warfare, you must, as Casey Haskins has said, who was leading the training at West Point when I interviewed him, we don't even know what the problems are when we go into new places in the Middle East. So we have to be able to both find problems and do discovery very well as much as do the planning. So this is as I've been out and spent time with a lot of big multinational corporations, this is absolutely one of the most difficult challenges that faces companies today. We all know that large companies have trouble innovating, but one of the biggest problems is that in today's age, when companies like Time Warner or Cisco are being disrupted right, left, and center by technology, they're still trying to get out of this mentality of putting everything into a spreadsheet and planning really before they are able to adapt on the fringes of what they're doing. And so a lot of these companies that ask me to come speak or ask me to spend time advising them really feel a sense of paralysis. They're just completely stuck. And they want to be more innovative. They want to be more adaptive, or at least the leaders say they do. And of course, everybody understands that if you want to continue to grow, you must. But there are very few incentives structurally that reward people for making mistakes, which is a really necessary element to doing anything new, to discovery. So I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So this is, Alan Kay was a very well-known technologist. He said the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And Steve Jobs really appreciated this quote. The question is how? So that's how I wrote this book, Little Bets, and this shares a mindset for discovery. And it begins with, instead of over-planning and over-analyzing, we need to shift to being able to discover through more of an experimental innovation mindset. And small bets are really the way to do that. So, for example, this is Muhammad Yunus. He's the founder of Grameen Bank, the leading microfinance provider, and he was an economist for many years in Bangladesh and was very passionate about poverty alleviation and had many theories and had many economic models for poverty alleviation that were not solving the problem. And he was struck by the mass of people who were coming and streaming into the streets of this city where he was working as a professor and dying by the hundreds as a poverty wave struck in Bangladesh. And so he decided that none of his theories, none of his economic theories could solve the problem. So he went out into the grassroots and literally spent a year in the small town of Joburg to really understand poverty from what he calls the worm's eye view. And so he gets out into the world and he understands, for example, that when people are trying to sell their baskets, their wicker baskets, that they're being charged so much by the people who they're buying their inputs from that they end up not being able to, they end up having to sell their baskets once they're produced to the same people, and these middlemen are just charging usury rates. So what you find is that by him going door to door and really asking many questions of these people to really understand the underlying problems of poverty, and discovering that one of the big problems was that these middlemen were essentially controlling both the inputs and the outputs, and therefore not allowing people to make any profit. He said, well, I can just lend these people some small amounts of money, and that will break the cycle. And that, in fact, was the key problem. And so whether it's in the military or in Time Warner or in entrepreneurship, one of the really key elements to thinking differently is to get out of the office and to be able to spend much more time empathizing with people and understanding problems from this worm's eye view. And one of the other things that Eunice did was try a lot of these small bets, these experiments, and many of them failed, but enough of them worked such that he could learn where the real problems and opportunities were. And the more that you're able to experiment, the better. This is the way that Hewlett-Packard used to go about developing its ideas when Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard were the founders and in control. And this is the classic entrepreneurial mindset. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is the first Hewlett-Packard calculator, the HP 35. And I love this example because it shows the type of planning mentality that I'm talking about. When Hewlett-Packard first invented this product, the company went out and asked SRI, which was at the time the leading market research firm in Silicon Valley, to go out and do some research and determine if this product could sell. And SRI went out and they found that the alternative to this calculator was very inexpensive slide rules, and that because this calculator was priced at, in today's terms, roughly $2,000 US, that SRI said this product can't sell. Now, using a more entrepreneurial approach to discovery, we see that at that same time, Bill Hewlett, co-founder of HP, had been on a plane with a random person, just a random guy who he had been talking with all the way on this plane flight. And he found that, at HP, he found that this guy who was just sitting with him on the plane loved the calculator, and he said he would buy one. So at HP, the researchers and the marketers were all sitting around when Bill Hewlett came back from his trip, and they said, well, here's the recommendation from SRI, this can't sell. And Hewlett then said, well, listen, somebody on the plane, I sat next to the guy, he said he'd buy one, so let's just build 1,000 and see what happens. So this was Bill Hewlett's approach to make small bets, and he determined that he was able to afford to lose 1,000 calculators, that was an affordable bet, that he could try that and see what happened. Well, within 5 months, Hewlett-Packard was selling 1,000 of these calculators a day. It was the fastest growing product in HP history, and this is the key insight about affordable losses in a discovery mindset. It's when you can't predict the future, the best way to try is to pick an affordable bet, something you're willing to lose, and you calculate that affordable loss up front before you try something, and then you try it, and then you discover new information, you learn, and then you continue from there. So that's the basic discovery mindset, and this comes from research that was done by a professor at the University of Virginia Darden Business School, Sarah Sarasvati, and she said that the biggest difference between the planning mentality that we're taught and the discovery mindset is that when you're doing planning, you are always thinking about what you can expect to gain, whereas when you're doing discovery, when expert entrepreneurs like Bill Hewlett do discovery, they think about what they can afford to lose in advance. So that's a very important switch that needs to happen. And I'm telling you, there are very few companies or people who do this well on a consistent basis. I think one exception to that is Amazon. At Amazon, Jeff Bezos will look at a new opportunity and he will say to the senior team, the S team as he calls it, are we excited about this opportunity? If we are excited about this opportunity, are we willing to bet on it if it can be only, say, a $10 million opportunity? That is, they think they can make $10 million on the opportunity from a revenue standpoint. They're excited about it. They have a hunch there's something more there. They will continue to bet on it. And they will put their best people on that opportunity. Well, this is how Amazon has grown into businesses like Amazon AWS Web Services and many other new initiatives by taking this more experimental approach, thinking about what they can afford to lose rather than trying to put into a spreadsheet. I'll spend time at companies like Intuit or a lot of the marketing-driven companies, and they'll always ask, can this be a $300 or $400 million opportunity? And that's just crazy when, as Bezos says, you can't put a new idea into a spreadsheet. So that's the principle of an affordable loss. And a little bit, therefore, is just a small, affordable risk that you can afford to take to discover something new. When you're in the unknown, you use these small bets. And once you discover the problems and the needs and the opportunities, then you bet big, as HP did. Okay. For some reason, can you hear me?
Peter, we can hear you. There are a couple of participants from the audience are requesting if the screen size can be enlarged because
the screen size can be enlarged, huh?
Yeah.
You know, I'm on my Apple. I don't
okay,
know how it can be enlarged.
Okay, so don't worry about it. Go ahead. I mean, folks, if you're seeing the small size, there is a zoom option available on the presentation screen which you're seeing above the green bar. Like the time is 9:22 a.m. right now. If you look at the top left, there is a webcam and a zoom option available. So you might as well make it a full view zoom.
Yeah, my apologies for that. I don't know why. Yeah, this is just I'm just working right from my MacBook Air here. Yeah. But can you see the slide though now? Where I was having some trouble with the presentation. But
no, yes, we can see it. We can see it. We are right now seeing.
Okay, great.
Yeah, the HP slide, and it's fine now. People have been able to fix it out. I think I'm receiving some comments there.
This is, Bill Hewlett estimated that they would need to make 100 small bets to get to 6 breakthroughs at Hewlett Packard. So whether you're an entrepreneur or working inside an established organization, the point is that you have to be willing to be wrong a lot in order to discover something new. And a lot of people will say or think or believe that they look at the Apple example and they say, well, there are certain people or certain companies who just have a knack for coming up with ingenious ideas. And I can assure you, having spent time with a lot of Apple people, that they try hundreds of prototypes for every new product, and that they have to fail a lot before they discover something new. So you have to have this more of a willingness to be imperfect, to learn as you go, and then the rewards are that you end up discovering things like the calculator. Now, just to clarify the research on this from a creative standpoint, there are people, this is David Galenson's a professor at the University of Chicago, who says that there are certain people, like Mozart, who could come up with ideas such as for a composition in the case of Mozart, and transcribe them all down on paper, in a sitting or with very few corrections or iterations. Now, Galenson calls these types of innovators conceptual innovators. They're very rare, and prodigies are, obviously very rare. Mozart was one, but most of us fall into the camp of Beethoven, who had to try reams of different ideas for every one that eventually worked. And he was known for constantly toiling late into the night. If you look at his transcripts, they were just pockmarked with changes and cross-outs and markups, and it was just a painful process to get to what was obviously a very, very fine end product. And these are experimental innovators, according to Galenson, and it's a far more common and far more interesting approach to innovation. Yet you have to be willing to be imperfect. You have to be willing to fail. And so another example of this I often cite is comedy, and coming up with good humor. For anybody who's seen a comedian like Jerry Seinfeld or Chris Rock struggle for night after night in small clubs to come up with ideas, the same is true for the Onion, this humor publication, where they release statistics on how many failures they have to go to, and it takes 600 headline possibilities to come up with 18 every week for the Onion. So just a 3% success rate. So the point is, if you're not trying things, if you're not experimenting, you're really reducing your chances of being able to find something new and innovate. At Pixar, they call this process of discovering what ideas are going to work and which aren't going from suck to non-suck, and that's a quote from Ed Catmull, who's the president of Pixar. And the point is that at Pixar they use literally tens of thousands of storyboards for every film, and they'll work through in great detail the ideas for plot, character, all on paper before they get into the more expensive digital animation phase. And it's this process of showing those ideas to small audiences of people internally and then larger and larger audiences until they finally get to work through all the problems. And really that's the key, is to work through all the problems rather than avoid the risks. And Catmull's a great spokesperson for this necessity of being willing to be imperfect as you're developing ideas until you've iterated into something that is much cleaner, as a Pixar film would be at the end product. So at Pixar, they call people black sheep, the ones who are frustrated, the people who have a different way of doing things. And so my belief is that we're really moving into this era where people are going to be rewarded for finding new ways of connecting with like minds, people who are black sheep. In my estimation, can be investors, they can be entrepreneurs, they can be managers inside companies, they can be artists, but they have a willingness to work through the painful process of discovery, and they're also not afraid to challenge the status quo. And I think, you know, as I've seen and traveled now, spoken about all my work globally, there's this huge generation of people growing, what I call Gen Entrepreneur, people who realize that their careers are not going to be dependent on any one company anymore. They're going to be dependent on being able to be what a friend of mine, Chris Gergen, calls life entrepreneurs. And I think that we're seeing the very early stages of new types of guilds. And so what people inside Pixar call black sheep, I think, you know, we're the black sheep everywhere, and what we're doing is galvanizing a group of people across borders, across the world, who really believe passionately in combining assets, if you will, to be able to form a new type of guild. I'll explain a little bit more about what I'm talking about. But I think it all starts with this really strong recognition of where value comes from. And so this is, I mentioned previously Sarah Saraswati, this researcher who's now at the University of Virginia at Darden. This is a paper that someone sent me years ago that she wrote based on, called What Makes Entrepreneurs What Entrepreneurial. It's based on studying a handful, couple dozen expert entrepreneurs and giving them sample problems to solve to create new businesses, see how their minds actually work. So it's a cognitive analysis of how they went about a decision-making process in launching a new business. And the handwritten comments are from Vinod Khosla, who was a founder of Sun and who's a prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalist. So this paper got a lot of traction in Silicon Valley. And I'll just explain to you that one of the key conclusions and elements is that, you know, a lot of times we're trained to have this more engineering mindset, this predictive mindset, where we begin with a goal and then we take our given means and we work in a very linear way towards that goal. And it's really dependent upon understanding our existing knowledge and what assets we have to be able to predict the future. That is to say, well, you're Hewlett-Packard, you've got a big brand, you've done printers, so therefore you've done printers well, you've done terminals well. Why not just take the brand and those research assets and go get into doing you know, technology for the home, and it's in adjacent markets. And so basically what will happen is these companies will tend to go in and just take those means and try to apply it towards goal, and then they'll realize that unlike what Muhammad Yunus did, they really aren't solving for the underlying core need that exists. And oftentimes you can't even predict that need until you actually have gone out and done some experimentation, as Yunus had. So this planning mentality is that we can, to the extent that we can predict the future, we can control it. Now, an experimental mindset where you're really thinking of ways to invent value takes into account your assets and your given means, as Saraswati calls them, you know, who you are, what you know, who you know, what your networks are, you know, what type of expertise you have, what tastes and traits you have, and you combine those means with the means of other people, and you can create value with those assets, just as HP did with its calculator, by going out and leveraging those means across new networks. And so, you know, an example of this is that when you see how Starbucks came into existence, Howard Schultz had a few things going for him when he started what would become Starbucks. He knew that he'd had this really good coffee experience in Milan, Italy, and he knew that he had he thought that there was going to be this customer need in the U.S. because he'd been observing inside this coffee company where he'd been working, this coffee equipment company, he'd been observing trends in the coffee market in the United States. And so he thought, why not try to create this coffee experience in the United States? It was more of a European communal coffee experience. And he went out and he started to try to raise money for this, and he was able to become friends with and get the support of Bill Gates Sr., Bill Gates' father, to be his lawyer. So he had these things going for him, but he had really no idea how the United States market was going to respond to his vision, initial vision. And as it turned out, the first Starbucks had nonstop opera music playing. The baristas were all wearing bow ties, this Italian bow tie. The menus were in Italian, and so people really didn't respond well to the first Starbucks. In fact, there were no chairs in the first store. But what Schultz was able to do is he was able to find people like Howard Gehry to be his partner, and people with complementary skill sets, complementary networks like Bill Gates Sr., complementary assets, to then iterate and learn enough about what the underlying customer needs were going to be to create a new type of experience. It was this emergent process of experimental discovery, and as Howard says, we had to make a lot of mistakes to discover what would work. But this is essentially the more entrepreneurial mindset. It's taking what you have, your assets, your means, and leveraging those to create new forms of value without trying to plan or control the entire outcome. It's more harnessing the means that you have and then allowing the value and the end product to emerge. So I see this in General Electric, where they are working now to use General Electric as a platform. What are General Electric's assets? Well, General Electric has great access to academic partners. It has great networks. It has great physical assets. It has convening power, just like 10 Downing Street or the White House has convening power. These are very important forms of power in today's day and age because having spent a year inside GE, I can tell you that they're never going to be an entrepreneurial company. I mean, people there are trained to be solving very different types of problems and discovering new businesses. And they're great at solving known problems, but they're not so great at solving unknown problems. So what GE is doing increasingly is it's saying, okay, here's a problem that we have, an MRI device of the future. We don't exactly know where that technology is going, but we can convene the leading academics, the leading entrepreneurs, venture investors from this ecosystem and begin to develop relationships with them. And then we, GE, can start to be doing more venture type investing, making small bets, and turning our company into more of an entrepreneurial platform. I see this everywhere, and it's just begun. But the platforms you're a part of, the networks you're a part of, are really where the sources of value can be created. And in the Silicon Valley, the most kind of cutting-edge venture firms like Andreessen Horowitz are building out systems where they have it feels like you're sitting there in a LinkedIn system where they have all their networks in one place. And so for their entrepreneurs, they really become a talent management agency. They say, well, we can connect you with board members, we can connect you with customers, we've got it all right here in one database, and this is where value can be really created. And everybody has these networks, but it's a question of how you dial into bigger ones and ones that are aligned with your values. And that's really the point of the black sheep, is to find people who are, this is just a network map, right, where you have all these clusters of people. And there's a great book for those interested in different types of networks. You know, you have centralized networks. We're kind of the networks of the past. You have increasingly these decentralized networks, and more so than that, distributed networks. So let's say that we're part of, each of us is a part of distributed networks across the globe. Facebook is one way we're able to connect into those distributed networks. There's a book called Starfish and the Spider that talks about how to galvanize the distributed network, and they say that at the core, most important insight is that these networks have an ideology to them, a set of very clear values that bands them together. So, for example, you know, Al-Qaeda, just to use an example that everybody would be familiar with, has a very clear ideology and a very clear, easy way of gathering people together. Well, you know, I believe that the creative networks of the future are going to be bound together by this notions like black sheep, where, you know, people who are, whether they're artists or whether they're entrepreneurs searching for access to the larger platforms, or people like Beth Comstock, who was pictured there from GE, who has a very creative bent, will band together in these new types of guilds, with this intention being, in the case of black sheep, to make a real impact in the world and to have an underlying social innovation drive to them. So anyway, the next few slides just talk about that, and that pretty much concludes the bulk of my comments. But you know, what we're doing with Black Sheep is we're really trying to invent new approaches to problem solving by galvanizing these decentralized networks. And we have a Black Sheep outpost in London, we have one in Washington, D.C., we have one in Brazil, we have one in Barcelona. And you know, at the end of the day, our values are very much creative values. And we say that everybody who's involved needs to be contributing at least 5% of their time to social good causes. So, you know, you can sort of roughly guess the type of people that are going to be involved, but these are just a handful. You know, whether they come from the social entrepreneurship world, or you know, the media, or people who are entrepreneurs or designers or pianists even, they're bound together by these common set of values. And so we're out to build platform to support that type of guild, that new type of guild, an ecosystem, and to be a platform to disseminate thought leadership and to create new ventures. So that's us in London. And really, it all begins with these little bets, because that is where you know, you find the new opportunities and problems, and where you can create new value. And I really do believe that if you can combine the patrons, the power structure, if you will, people like executives inside these large companies like Time Warner, GE, or people who are investors or what have you, with the more creative innovators, that you can create a hell of a valuable ecosystem. And I think we'll see these popping up right, left, and center as people realize that, hey, I could work in a company for 2 or 3 years, but really, do I identify with that company, or do I identify with something deeper? And we found that people really identify with Black Sheep personally, so that if you pick up the phone and call Cisco, or you call, you know, The Economist or McKinsey or what have you, you have Black Sheep who are excited to be a part of this new type of guild. So I think that's where things are going, and that's sort of the latest from the front lines here in California and what we're seeing. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions that people might have and engage in some back and forth. I'm sorry that presentation was a little bit disjointed, but I just wanted to share some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. So, folks, yes, if you have any questions, you could either raise your hand. There's a hand icon on your webinar console, so if you click on it, I'll be able to give you an opportunity to speak to Peter and ask your question, or you could put your questions in the question box, chat box, and I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf. So you could raise your hand, or you could put your questions in the chat box. I'll go ahead because there are already a few questions in the chat box. There's an interesting one. Peter, somebody asked, you mentioned failure to experiment ideas are important. Can you explain it a little more, and what exactly one should focus in the learning process outcome from this experiment?
Sure. So I'll use a simple analogy to explain this. I write about this in the book. Chris Rock, the comedian, seems perfect when we see him on a big stage, like, or when we see him on an HBO special. But in order to get there, he spends 6 months to a year in small clubs trying out ideas for what will work. So when I say failure, what I mean is that Chris Rock is not afraid to put himself in a low-risk environment, that is an audience of 40 or 50 people, to try ideas that oftentimes flop with that audience in order to see where the needs and the problems of the audience are, and he will then, in a very informal way, riff on ideas with the audience to discover where a new joke might start to appear, and then he will iterate that time and time again for, sometimes months before he comes up with something that's great. So this notion of failure is one that people struggle with all around the world. And I'm telling you, entrepreneurs think of learning the way most people think of failure. And so that's really the key point I want to make, is that if you are doing something new, find the early adopters, find the people who can offer the most insight, try experiments with them, and let them know that it's an imperfect idea. But the only way to discover something, whether it's a book or a new company opportunity or a new approach to doing incentives inside an established organization, is to try it. I mean, that's really the fact. And so, we often get obscured by the belief that these ideas are just come up with instantaneously, and that's just at odds with the research and reality. So I hope that helps. Okay.
We have a question. So let me see. I think it's posted, but let me see if somebody from Washington. I'm going to unmute. ECP page. Could you hear us? Hello, ECP? I've unmuted your microphone. The nickname is mentioned, ECP page. And you could speak to Peter from Washington. Okay, maybe we are having... Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Could you please introduce yourself, and please feel free to ask a question after introducing yourself.
I really appreciate it. Thanks. It was a great presentation. I'm really inspired. Thanks for putting this on. My name's Elizabeth. I'm over in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm really interested in the whole, what you're talking about, and sort of combining it with what they're coming out with in terms of lean entrepreneurship. So I see a nice balance in what you're suggesting, and just actually a lot of depth in what you've presented today. And I've been in a kind of startup situation, and the one thing I've been missing is finding that network of like-minded people. It's a social entrepreneurship initiative, and it's really based on Muhammad Yunus's work, his economic work, and the Grameen Village Women phone system, as well as C.K. Prahlad's work on Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. So I've really looked into the economics of it, and I'm very passionate about it. It really is to globalize knowledge as currency, providing equal access to knowledge and learning. But my biggest problem has always been finding like-minded people with this social conscience and with some capacity to, how do I get them involved or get others engaged?
I think it's a huge problem. I mean, I experienced it. Thank you for your kind comments and for the question. I've experienced it myself as an author and entrepreneur. And so the best solution that I've been able to come up with is to create this new type of company, which is a network organization.
Mm-hmm.
And in Washington, actually, we're going to have an event for the Black Sheep, Washington, D.C. Thursday, April 25th, and so I think that might be a really good event for you to check out. You can find out more about it one of two ways. One is, the best way is through our Facebook page, which is just BLK SHP. If you type that in, you'll see our Facebook page, and then we'll be putting information on about that event coming up in just a couple weeks in Washington. There's a whole network of like-minded people there. And hopefully we'll have that to roll out in different parts of the world over the next couple of years. But for now, it's just a handful of these locations. But yeah, I agree. I think people, you need strong support structures when you're doing creative work. And whether it's entrepreneurs or I found artists or people who are just really creative investors even, or people who are just curious, who have a collaborative mindset, are increasingly coming together in these communities around the U.S. and around the world. So Ashoka is another good organization, I think, to bring people together on the social side. And then there are a number of these groups starting up called like Sandbox on the entrepreneurship side, and trying to think of some of the others. Those are the ones that come to mind: Ashoka, Sandbox, and then what we're up to with Black Sheep.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. And can someone type that into the text box, your Facebook page, so I can just get that down, right?
Yeah.
And I'd love to certainly participate on the 25th.
Yeah,
Cool.
Peter, I don't know if you can type it to me in the chat box, or maybe you can write it on your screen so I can broadcast it as well to everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, here you go. This one. So
You see it?
yeah. Perfect. So if you can send
That's
me
the
that.
page.
Okay. All right. Great. So, Elizabeth, you have any supplementary, or should we move to another question?
Yes, I do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question, Elizabeth. Okay, we have another one from Brother Umair Murtaza. He said, thanks, Peter, for your presentation. Truly inspirational. Has the time now come to believe more in the notion of prepare to fail, to approach success, than to be intimidated by fail to prepare notion, as the latter has been plaguing us for perhaps too long? What are your comments?
Well, I think it's a great question. Thank you very much for it, man. I think that, this whole term of failure has a very weighty grip on people around the world. And the reality is that we're living in a time when you really need to get out and be prepared to be imperfect and to discover in your job, in your career, and regardless of your entrepreneurial interests, you have to be willing to just get out there and learn different skill sets, because our educational systems globally have been so focused on this rote learning, on this industrial set of knowledge learnings, really at the expense often of creative, critical thinking skills, that we really have to change the whole education system. And this is happening around the fringes. It's kind of fascinating to watch, because parents are saying we don't want our children to be afraid of failure by just focusing on their rewards, on just focusing on getting the right answer. And so the research that's really rising to the fore is research from people like Carol Dweck at Stanford, who's shown that she's probably the leading researcher on how different types of people respond to failure. She's really found and shown that if you're young and you have a kid who takes a test and they don't do well, and all that they're praised for is the outcome of the test, whether they get say a high grade, a high mark or not, then if they don't do well on tests, they're much more likely to not want to take it again. Well, this is what she calls a fixed mindset. That's the belief that our abilities are fixed, they're set in stone. Whereas people who are encouraged to just work harder and to study harder to be able to do better on the test next time are people who, she says, have more of a growth mindset. And all of us kind of fall into this spectrum of fixed versus growth mindset. That is, if we were praised a lot when we were young for our successes, our achievements, as most of us are, then we're going to tend to have more of a fixed mindset. But the way we break free from that is by willing to get out in the world and try things and be imperfect. And through this kind of deliberate practice of, to your questioner's point, becoming more comfortable with imperfection and failure, we develop literally a muscle that allows us to become much more comfortable with that process of learning. And that's really all we're talking about. It's like when you're young, when you're a kid, that's how we learn everything. We try something, it's hot, we then learn we shouldn't touch something anymore. Well, that's exactly what life brings us, especially in the modern era. And so we have to become much more comfortable with that process of learning and much less worried about having everything be perfect, because then if life is pretty boring if everything's perfect. And we all know that the innovators are the ones who are willing to try a lot of things. And my argument is just try to do that in a way that's also cognizant of risk, and that's also very astute to the fact that, hey, you don't want to ruin your reputation by going out there on the public stage and doing something that is just off-brand or that is stupid. But you find these places where you can experiment and learn there, and make these small bets in places that are affordable and achievable. And then once you've done those well, then scale up.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Let's move to another questioner who has raised her hand, Mr. Naveed Khwaja. Mr. Naveed Khwaja, could you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the very insightful and profound thoughts, Peter. I am actually in a similar field, and as the previous caller mentioned, we have been looking for some kind of access to such a network where people are actually working on corporate or actually social responsibility, as well as helping organizations to get innovative and trying all those things. So I'm from London, and I help organizations improve their innovation and motivation with productivity. So similar to you, I've been helping GE in their Cambridge office in the UK to get more entrepreneurial. And in that period of about 18 months, I could see all those changes happening. But one thing that I see missing, and I don't know whether you had better experience on that, was their collaboration with smaller startups. I'm talking about collaboration, not acquisition.
Right.
Have you seen anything similar there with your experience?
I think I'll tell you who's really good at it is Beth Comstock, who's the Chief Marketing Officer of GE. She spends more time in the startup community than any other executive I know in the United States.
Oh, really?
She's phenomenal. She is the exception to the rule, and I don't think that GE collaborates well because their culture is so strong around leadership and managing, as you know, it's all about management controls and leadership and and budgetary reviews and finance reviews. So it's not a culture that's really well suited for collaboration. And it remains to be seen whether the marketing department can usher in a new era of collaboration at GE. But I do have tremendous confidence in Beth's experiments and in her personally being able to collaborate, because she's really one of the most collaborative people I know. So stay tuned, and I'll tell you what, if companies don't learn how to collaborate, they're going to lose all the talent. So the talent is really what I think is driving a lot of this discussion at this point. And we all know that from Sarah Sarasvathi's research even, that if you have access to the best talent, then you're much more likely to create value. So I think all these executives at GE recognize that they're needing to become a much cooler and more collaborative place if they want to retain the best talent. So that's one encouraging thing.
Okay, thanks for that. And the last bit would be, do you have a London chapter? I'll follow your Facebook page.
We do have a London chapter that's currently underground, but will be above ground in the near future. So that will also be publicized on Facebook. Really what they're doing is they're just trying to figure out the basic model and approach. They're modeling it after the old coffee houses of old, which is pretty innovative. We're kind of learning from London as they piece together their prototypes. And they're just starting up as we speak. But if you stay tuned to the Facebook page, they'll have public events coming up soon. It's going to be a really cool chapter, I think.
Okay.
Okay, I look forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Naveed, any supplementary, or should I move to another question?
No, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for posing the question. I guess we have just a couple of more minutes. So We can take a few more questions, or maybe just two more. There's an interesting one, Peter. How important is the element of trust, posing trust in small bets? What is the risk of being vulnerable to putting your trust in every bet?
Trust in bets. Well, I'll tell you, trust is fundamental to collaboration. I mean, I thought that that was where the question was coming from. When it comes to trust and bets, I mean, I do think it's important to be able to trust the people you're sharing your very early stage ideas with, because when you're incubating a new idea, there's one thing that happens very easily is that somebody comes in with judgmental language and then ruins the experiment or ruins the bet. And this happens often inside large organizations. They have a term for it at Google that they call the hippo phenomenon, which is that the highest paid person's opinion, the hippo, is the person who makes the decisions creatively. And if that happens, then there really isn't a very high degree of trust. So more ideally, I think what I find is that people are comfortable sharing their early stage experiments with friends and very trusted people that they then learn from, and then as they iterate those experiments into something a little bit more concrete that can be shared with a broader audience, then you can start to get some more data back and move into a more quantitative analysis of what experiments are working or what aren't. But at the very earliest stages, you really need people who can help build ideas. And at Pixar, they call this plussing, which is to literally take an idea and to use non-judgmental language to build the idea, such as and what if, rather than but and anything, saying, yeah, but that's not a good idea, that judgmental language, because it really kills the creativity.
Okay, let's just take one last question. Have you identified any set of common behavioral patterns among black sheeps so we can focus on those personal traits during hiring process?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we found is that, we have probably about 2,000 people now who we've identified as black sheep across the globe, and these are people who are very curious. Very curious is a hugely common quality, and generous is another common quality. So these are not people who, there's no assholes. My friend Bob Sutton at Stanford wrote the book, The No Asshole. There are none of them. These are all people who are curious and generous for the most part. And those qualities then lead to a lot of collaborative opportunities. And they also lead to non-transactional forms of relationship building. So we really don't have, there's nobody who we can identify as being particularly transactional in our network at this stage, which is also pretty interesting. And I don't know, we're going to have to work hard to continue to maintain that. That's why we call it an ecosystem rather than a network.
Okay, that brings us really towards the end of the webinar. But before I conclude, Peter, there are participants who have actually requested that if you could post the contact information for the upcoming event on April 25th. So if maybe you could just send it to me in the chat box and I'll broadcast to everyone, or?
Yeah, the location is being finalized this week, so it will be broadcast on our Facebook page.
Okay.
The Black Sheep page.
So folks,
also put it out through Twitter.
So as Peter said, so stay tuned to his Facebook page and it will be broadcasted on it, the contact details and everything. So again, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar because the time is almost there, about 60 minutes, the constraint we had. Thank you very much, Peter. I would like to thank you on behalf of MILE for your time and willingness to share this valuable information and your experiences and details about your books. And also thanks to all of you who participated and made it an interactive experience for all of us. But once again, Peter especially, thank you to you. And any conclusion words you want to say in the end, so feel free to say it.
No, it was my pleasure, and I just think it sounds like your audience is very like-minded, and it's a pretty exciting time to be alive and to have these types of passions and to be looking for these like-minded networks, and I do think it's the future. So let's just keep at it and lock arms and make some good things happen. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. Absolutely, and we would certainly like to have you again, considering you're subject to your availability in the future. But folks, with that, I would like to end the webinar, and